Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today earned an MFA in creative writing and writing for the performing arts from the University of California Riverside at the age of 40. She went on to teach playwriting and theater courses at her alma mater for the next 17 years. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in journals such as Hip Mama, Faultline, Inlandia, and Cherry Tree. She is also a playwright and has had over a dozen plays produced. Her debut novel, The Shinnery, is set in West Texas in the 1890s and is inspired by a family secret and her great-great-grandfather's trial for murder. She lives in her hometown of Riverside, California, residing in a 100-year-old bungalow with her husband and pets, a geriatric poodle, and a beloved tuxedo cat. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Kate Anje.
Thank you, Julia. I'm so happy to be here. It's rather an out-of-body experience. So thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for being here, Kate. Our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Okay, as a listener, I am ready for this one. And I am going to quote from the immortal words of the Grateful Dead. All good things in all good time.
Amen, sister.
It took me till I was over 50 because that was the time that became available for me, and also a little bit of the time that I carved out as the clock is ticking for all of us. I always loved to write. I always knew I wanted to write a book, like so many of your guests. And I had this wonderful teacher. It was the 70s where you had the mixed classrooms with all the different grades. And he had written a novel and he shared it with the class. It was read aloud days. And it was his family in Louisiana, and they were lighthouse keepers. And like to see this man in my classroom who I respected so much, that he could do it. He was a real person. You know, writers weren't these people in these castles that were so far away. And that really inspired me. And he was so smart. If you got done with all your work, you got a big reward. And that was what it was. You got to do more writing. So he had a cardboard box in the class with just random images. And you could go and pick an image and write stories about it. And I would zoom through my work so I could do more work. But I remember I had this picture, and it was a grandma. I thought she was a grandma. She probably turns out she was 47, but to me, she was very old. And she was on a motorcycle. And I started writing this series of stories about Grandma Gertrude, the motorcycle riding mama, or something bizarre. And I just loved that, creating a character. And I kept doing more and more stories about her. And I thought they were excellent. And it was so fun. And I actually wish that writing was as fun for me today, because I can't say I still feel that way about it, although a lot of writers do, and I'm envious. But so I always loved to write. And I was an undergraduate theater major in college. So I gravitated towards plays, and I wrote a few plays. And then I made some life choices. In about 5 years, I had 3 children, and they're all boys. So it was a very busy household and a busy life. But I would write little things here and there, and like essays that were kind of prompted by what was happening, and they would be published. I had a series of kind of gardening and life essays in our local newspaper. And then I was privileged enough to meet a good friend who at the time was not big time writer like she is now, but that was Gail Brandeis. And Gail, and actually I should plug her. So she just has this book called Drawing Breath, and it's essays on writing the body and loss. And it just came out and it's so good for writers and I recommend it. But she was going to graduate school, a low residency MFA program. And for those of your listeners who might not know low residency, it's you go twice a year for 1 week. So it's a real concentrated time. And the rest of the time you're doing online exchanges. And she would share her reading list with me. And I remember like the first one I read as a fake graduate student was Madame Bovary. And it was, I just paid attention to the work as an instructor. Like, how is this composed? How do they do it? And I, instead of reading for pleasure, which I had always done, I really started reading to understand how it was done. And then I thought, well, I'd like to go to get an MFA. And so I applied to a different low residency program all across the country, and I didn't get in. And of course, it was a blow to my ego. I was devastated. And it turns out, as things in life do, that it was probably a fantastic thing that I didn't get in, because a couple years later, maybe even within a year, my alma mater, UC Riverside, announced they were starting an MFA program. And that was started by Susan Straight, the author Susan Straight, and Eric Barr, who had been my theater advisor. And I got in there. It was less than 2 miles from my house. I loved the institution and I had full fellowship, so no student loans. And I got teaching experience, which I wouldn't have had at low residency. So it just, things work out. And it was a fantastic opportunity. And it was just that time for writing. So I don't think everyone needs an MFA. I didn't get a magic bullet, right? So if you're going to spend, tens of thousands, it was just about the time that I carved out the time. And so our program was dual. And so I did theater, playwriting, and I did fiction, but then you can only do one thesis. And I went on the playwriting thing and I continued to do that. And I was hired, and then I had commissions to write plays, that is the best way. If you can get a commission, because it's a deadline, someone actually wants it and they're waiting for it. And if you're deadline driven, you get it done. But the fiction kind of languished, a few short stories, a few more essays, but I didn't focus on it. And part of it was life, although I know writers with more kids than I had that seemed to get it done. But for me and my temperament and my responsibilities, it just didn't seem to happen. So I taught at the university. I worked as a writer and a research for commercial real estate, and it's a good life, but it didn't leave a lot of room. And then as I approached my 50th birthday, I had that, what am I doing with my wild and precious life, my one wild and precious life, as the poet Mary Oliver says. And I just thought, I want to do this. This has been a lifelong dream. And I had an idea for a novel. And it's hard when you're committing to this process, because I didn't know how long it would take, but I knew it would be a long time. And there was no roadmap. I didn't know how to write a novel per se. And so it's like, you're going to invest all this time, and what will be the payoff? And I think there's some joy in process for me, but it's not like, oh, happy I get to write. Oh, my special time. I can't wait. So I quit my job. I quit not teaching at that point, but I quit my commercial real estate job, which I loved. I loved working with those people. And one of your questions that I hear you ask guests is, what was the best money you ever spent on writing? That was the best money I didn't earn. So we can say, in effect, that I spent that money, that I was willing to let that go, and that I had support of my partner. But it was, it was a sacrifice, but then it opened that space. And it was the age of 50 that I was able to, something that I was dreading then became my superpower. So that's why it took so long, because I needed to turn 50 apparently, and I needed to carve that space out.
Well, it really all came together for you. That was great. And And I think we have to take time to learn this craft of writing fiction because it is so different than script writing. I took a script writing course and I missed the interiority that you can do in fiction because it was more about directing the actors and dialogue. And I missed being able to tell the reader what I wanted them to know instead of depending on the actors to do so. So that must have been a difficult transition for you.
Yeah. And for me, I couldn't figure out what do you leave in and what do you leave out. It's like, okay, now, because limitations are kind of freeing in a way, because through your dialogue, you have to create the scene. You have to, a dialogue has to be very active. And I actually think that helps in my fiction writing. But all of a sudden, I'm like, the interiority that was a gift. I love interiority. Well, hard part for me was like, well, how much do I describe? Like, oh, do I have to say what they're wearing every time and what the place looks like and all? Like that felt like a burden. And the balance of that was tricky for me to understand. And it took a lot of editing and a lot of time to figure out this is not enhancing your story.
We all have difficulty leaving out a lot of backstory. So that's always a problem, I think, for authors.
Absolutely.
Well, once you had written this book, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, decide to choose a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
I did pursue an agent, and I pursued an agent for quite a long time. And I don't know that I have a lot of advice on this because it's like kind of that shoot for the moon, right? You're gonna get a really good agent. You're gonna, hello, New York, I'm here. And so I tried, and I even targeted things. Like I didn't just randomly send out. I really studied agents. I read interviews with them, and part of it is the vagaries of the market. Part of it is what I was writing. I kept upping my query and, figuring out how to do that better. I think my early queries were probably terrible, but it's hard. They're getting a gazillion people reaching out to them, and they're looking to sell a book that they can describe in 2 seconds and is hot, and it's hot. A lot of things are high concept, and it was like, how do you position your books? That's one thing they want to know. And I'm like, oh, it's a women's story, it's historical fiction, it's Western, it's literary fiction, so that was tough. And I feel like in a way I wasted time on it, not to discourage anyone from doing it, but I think I because they caution you, please do not submit to 1,000 people. Some people say they want exclusive. Well, that would be great if they got back to you in a timely manner. And again, I know I'm not putting it on them. It's just how it works, right? And so I feel like it kind of took too long. So I would have, if I were doing it over, I probably still would have tried to reach out to agents, but I would have done more at one time. And along the way, though, I was lucky enough. Thank you, agents who give feedback, right? Even if it's just a little, because some I just like literally just went in a bucket. I never heard a thing back. But I did get some helpful feedback along the way. And from one agent in particular gave me notes. And that really helped me do a rewrite, because that's the thing. It's like, oh, I'd love to improve this book. So you want to pick it up and run with it. But you go as far as you can. And luckily I had two women. That was another thing that helped me. I should have shout out to meeting with other human beings and sharing writing. So a regular writing group is that accountability. It's that attaboy, keep going. I guess that would be attagirl. But I thought that was really an important component of it. But, you can only go so far. So feedback was great. And then I think I'd done that. I had finished the book. I'd finished the book a number of times and thought it was perfect. And I had been trying to get an agent. And then I just said in 2021, that's it. This is the year. So I was going to go to hybrid. I was going to self-publish. I didn't care at that point. I just wanted it to be in my hands. You spend so much time and then it's like, okay, I can't go any farther. This is it. And I was just anxious for my family to read it. And I just wanted it done. Then I said, well, I'll try university presses. And I think actually Susan Straight was like, yeah, you should do that. And I found University of Nebraska Press, Bison Books. Again, research who you're sending to. It was like, we want stories of the West, untold stories of women. We publish fiction. And like, oh, this sounds great. And it was the first university press I submitted to. And I think I had a yes within a week. And it was like, it had to go through a process and then have more people at the press read it. But it was a dream come true at that point. And this is the thing too about being our age, at least for me. Like, I won't say I've never gone down the rabbit hole of like, I should have done this sooner. The career I could have had, that's natural, that's human, but I've had a great life. And now it's just all butter on the biscuit, as they say. It's just fabulous. So everything is, I'm grateful, and I just in a place where I can savor the experience. So it was fantastic. It was all celebration, and the press has been wonderful. I didn't even know, I'd read a couple of things by them, things I didn't know. Then I started looking at my bookshelf. Oh, University of Nebraska Press. But great reputation, and I just feel really lucky to have connected with them. But I would have hybrid or self-published. There are so many great opportunities of that. And in the Women Writing the West conference that I attended, where I met you, there's so many women doing that, and men as well. This was focused on women, and something like She Writes Press, I've met a number of authors from there. So I think that's also great. I think things are really changing. It's a strange time to be in publishing, but it's also pretty exciting.
There really are so many options these days that writers don't have an excuse not to publish. And I think it's very impressive that you were picked up by a university press. I think that's very impressive.
Thank you. I didn't know to be impressed, and now I'm impressed.
Yeah. You should be.
They have great books. And one time, this is one of the perks of being a writer, they asked me to do a review of a manuscript. And I did. And they said, well, would you like this, very small check? Or you could, I think it was double that amount in books. And you can guess what I picked.
Very good. Well, it sounds like your inspiration was a great great grandfather. How did you actually determine the plot of your book?
So, I heard this story from a distant cousin on a genealogy trip. And it was the story that was a secret in my family. My grandmother lived to be 93, and she never knew this happened in her own family. And she was born just a handful of years after events happened. And the thing I learned is that my great-great-grandfather had been on trial for murder in 1895. And it was like shocking. I thought my family was just so boring, right? Just hardworking ranchers and farmers. And to have this in your family history, and this cousin who was a genealogist showed us all these newspaper clippings. And we learned the story. And it was that his daughter, my great-great aunt, who I call Jessa in my novel, was seduced. And she was a naive young woman. She was 17 years old. And she was, as the newspaper account said, she was made to love him. So this young man seduced her with the promise of marriage. And then not only did she get pregnant, but she was, sorry, these are spoilers, but you can still read the book. There's lots you don't know. She was forced into prostitution, which is shocking even now. It's, we talk about people being kidnapped now, and women, forced into sex work against their will, trafficked. Sorry, I can't think of the term. And here, it was happening in 1895, and the terror of her family being brought down by this. She felt like she had no choice. So it is a book that involves traumatic events. I think I've handled it in a way that readers are not overwhelmed by it. But it is a true story, but there's a lot I couldn't know. The trial transcripts are no longer in existence. There was a fire. and it happened in Stonewall County is where events happened. But we did have newspaper clippings, and I had one letter that was written by one of her sisters later on that briefly touched on things. But here it was 120 years later, and this cousin was very protective of the story. And what I read on it was this feeling of shame. It was shameful in the family. And my aunt was writing a genealogy book, and he said, well, you can write about the trial. You can mention the trial. But he didn't want her to mention about his daughter. And I just thought that bothered me, that she was forced to carry the shame. And I love the work of Brene Brown, who the shame researcher from Texas, and her thing about shame lives, in secret. And so I wanted to understand what happened. Like, how did she become an easy pick for this person when she lived on this farm? And so that part I had to invent. But as we invent things along the way, it's amazing how you find little things. Oh, I made that up, but guess what? Here's precedent in the family for a daughter being sent away as a mother's helper, which is what happens in the novel with Jessa. So I knew there was, I knew the broad story, I had dates, and I knew I wanted to use actual newspaper excerpts. So that kind of afforded me a plot. I'm like, it's funny because I'm trying to work on my second project, and I'm like, darn it, I need something to anchor me down. The other thing is there's a pregnancy in the book. And so I knew that timeline would also be part of it. I also knew I wanted to keep it somewhat short timeline. I love sweeping family sagas. I remember reading the Thornbirds as a kid and thinking this is so great. But for me personally, I wanted to keep it somewhat simple for my first novel. And even thinking about my second project and starting it, I like short timelines. I think that helps plot-wise, at least for me. Again, coming from theater limitations, I like those limitations. So that is how I kind of came up with my plot, is because it was a found story somewhat. And then my ending is, I had some clues about how the family reacted at the end from photos and things, but the ending for Jessa is really my own invention. And someone on Goodreads, how did they describe it? I might have said it was a little corny, but they loved it anyway. And I thought, one ending I wrote was really I was just tying it up in a bow, and it's a happy ending. And I thought, well, that doesn't feel right. But of course, it is hard. I mean, my character suffered. It's hard to have your character suffer. And at times writing scenes, I was in tears along with her. So I do feel hopeful, and I think that is about my approach to life as well. So the ending is one of hope, but it is not tied up in a bow any longer.
Well, I think that's a good thing. And aren't they taking a historical true event and wrapping it in fiction? Aren't they calling that creative nonfiction these days?
I do write some creative nonfiction. I think I've pushed it there so much I don't know. And I don't use their names. And that was, again, that bizarre thing that hung over me, this is a secret. And this cousin, who was no longer alive, would somehow be upset. I was worried his kids might be upset. And my aunt was hovering over me like I was, what are you writing? What are you doing? She was so protective of it. And then the funny thing is, I met my cousins, the genealogist's kids. I met them. Some came to a book signing. One I met on our road trip and book tour in Oklahoma. They hadn't known about the story. Their dad didn't even tell them. So they had the materials, but sometimes when there's someone in your family that does family history, you're like, I don't need to do that. I'll just let it sit in a box. So they really hadn't looked through it all. So, and they were thrilled. They were thrilled that their dad's work had given rise to capturing some part of our history. And what was really important to me, and we haven't talked about, is place. So place is really important to me in capturing place. And I think it's because of my relationship, where I live in Riverside, although it's, become more of a, we've come up in the world, right? But growing up here, it was always described as its attributes were how close it was to everything else. We were 45 minutes from the beach, 45 minutes from the desert, 45 minutes from the mountains. It's like, but what are we to ourselves? And this place in West Texas, I mean, so many, I don't need to tell you, of the small towns are like ghost towns. Literally, where the novel takes place is a ghost town. And the other town, which was eventually our family's P.O. box, that's essentially a ghost town. And so I love that landscape because hardy people live and thrive there. And I find beauty in desert and dry, and because it's the miracle of the rain and what grows. And I think the Brazos River in its deep reds and its sandstone cliffs, I think it's beautiful. And so it's really important for me to capture that. And I feel like it's a little bit of a love letter to the area and to the people of the area. And I found that when I was doing book tour and doing events.
Well, that leads us to what your title means.
So I have a paragraph from my book that I found where Jessa reflects on what is the Shinnery. So the title's the Shinnery. And I got the name from a map that my genealogist cousin had made. It was this kind of hand-drawn map. And he was a map maker, so it was looking pretty good. And he had done these little triangles, and he had written the Shinnery, and it was right next to the family homestead. And it was a swath of land. And I was like, well, what is that? I don't even know if he told me at the time, but then I researched it because I don't know, I just liked that word. And it was based on a French word, and it referred to the shin oak that grew in the region. And the shin oak, actually at one time, it's native. It grew from all the way down, I think even to what we now call the Mexican border, all the way up to North America, up to Canada. And it was one of those plant systems where it's the rhizome system and the roots speaks to each other like aspen trees. And they say it's like really it was one plant. And I want to read that little bit because I think she describes it better than I'm going to describe it right now.
Okay.
So this is about the Shinnery. She had to move the cows out of the pastures that bordered the Shinnery to keep them from eating berries that were toxic to the cattle for a few weeks each year. A lot of ranchers destroyed their Shinneries for this reason, but Papa had taught Jessa better. Without the expanse of the low-growing thicket of shin oak, the sandy plateau it occupied would eventually collapse and blow away. They'd lose all the tall grass that took root in the Shinnery, big blue stem switchgrass and dropseed, food for many creatures, from cattle to cottontails. The thicket's fall acorns fed the hogs and the deer and the pronghorn, and before they were driven out, the Comanches. It also provided shelter to prairie chickens, turkeys, bobwhites, and quail. All that Jessa loved about her home was held by the roots of the Shinnery, roots said to go on for miles. Its budding was a danger, but only if you didn't take care. To eliminate the danger was to lose the vitality of the place. So I chose the title because I love the metaphor of the Shinnery. It protected, and it was something I found old advertisements in old newspapers, and it would say, come to Stonewall County, we have a Shinnery belt. And I learned from a biologist that the Shinnery belt besides all the reasons just mentioned about habitat and soil erosion, that it was something that cattle could come up against, and it kept the cattle warm and protected them from those bitter winds. And I like this thing that cares for us and has these positive attributes, also has this shadow side. And what a great metaphor for life. So that's why the title.
Well, you've described it beautifully, and you've described the place I live here in Texas. I could see that in my mind's eye as you read that passage.
And it's so, sad now because there is some shin oak there. You can find the shrub, but it's not like it was. It used to be like it was waist high, and so many cattle ranchers, and then the oil boom, and it's just mostly gone. And there are along the edges of roadway, because of the water runoff, you will find some. They're much taller and they're different, but they don't do the job that they did anymore. And they used to do, which is why the lesser prairie chicken, for example, is so endangered.
Well, Kate, have you found any publicity that works or maybe that didn't work for this book?
So that's in the same way as a first-time writer, I was trying to figure out how to write a novel. I feel like as a first-time author, I'm still trying to figure out how to publicize a novel, how to get the book out there. And mostly what I've done, I'm not a huge social media person. Before this came along, I hadn't been on Facebook in 4 years. Hashtag politics. And on Instagram, I was taking pictures of my cat. So I of course, I'm engaging in that way, but I think it's just one-on-one. One of the things I'm really trying to do is like book groups. So anywhere, if you have a Zoom book group and you live in Wisconsin, actually I'd like to come to Wisconsin. I'd like to go anywhere because I love traveling the American countryside, but I do Zoom books, and that's the idea of they tell two friends and they tell two friends and so on, right? So building an audience that way. I just feel really comfortable. I love talking to readers as a person who's been in a bunch of book clubs and loves reading, and it's so gratifying to hear people identify with the characters and arguing about the characters, and that's been really wonderful. I have a publicist with the press, and so they've done a really good job of getting it reviewed places. So I just found out Historical Novel Society, I just got notice yesterday, got a review, and it was a lovely review. Some of the Western writings, so that's been really nice. The publicist has done some of that. I don't want to complain, but one thing I heard was really great is if you can write essays in support of your book, so things that are happening in current events and current topics. And I spent a lot of time writing like different essays, and then it would be like, oh, we just published, that's a current event, but we just published 3 on the Me Too, or we did whatever it was. And because I think this book has a lot of relevancy as Me Too and the role of women, and women not having agency over their own choices, especially as what's going on. But so I have not found a magic key. I have not hired a publicist. I can see the utility in that. My book is actually selling quite well for it being quite well for a small press. Right. And because I asked that number early on, how many books will it take to where you're like, okay, this was worth it? And I didn't get an advance, so it's all gravy, right? So it's doing well, and I think it's mostly word of mouth. My community was really supportive. I had a ton of people at the launch. I did a book tour that I did myself, so I just the equivalent of cold calling, and I wanted to go where the place where the book was written. And I'm so into history. I also wanted to see Oklahoma, where my grandfather was born, and they had a genealogy society. They had a library. So things that I think relate to the book, I've been reaching out, and that's been my approach. But I'm always willing to learn more about that. They talk about that first year being so important for a novel. And I do have a little bit of like apprehension that I'm not doing it right, whatever right looks like. So
I'm sure you are doing it right. And, you know, we're told how important these first 6 months are and all of this. But, you know, I'm discovering books myself from years ago. So readers are going to still find our books long after that 1 year mark.
thank you. That's good to hear. And yeah, I mean, I often wait for books. So yeah.
Do you have any other books in you?
I thought I was going to hit the ground running. So here's another thing I did. I quit my other job. I have no job. My husband jokes that I'm a stay-at-home mom, and it's much better when you actually don't have children at home. I recommend it. But yeah, I wanted to be able to spend this year and travel and support the book that I had written and just, again, enjoy it. And then I wanted to have this space to write another book faster, right? I'm finding a little, and it's just so weird. And so comparison is the thief of joy. So really try not to compare, but it's hard when you meet a lot of great women, for example, through Women Writing the West, and they're like, this book, I just had this book out. Now I have this other book out. And I'm just like, how do you do that? The mind space when you're working on promoting one book to fully enter into another, I find that difficult. So maybe it's an excuse. I also have like I said, it's not that, oh, I get to write. It's like, oh, I get to write. And every book starts with a blank page, but I am doing research, historical fiction, the summer of 1974. And it involves Avon, the Avon Lady's Daughter is the working title, but yeah, just exploring a woman's journey and kind of a, feminist is such a loaded word, which is so strange to me, but her journey towards finding herself through this prototypical Avon thing, this idea of, we think, makeup and that kind of thing can get such a bad rap, right? We're hiding our authentic selves. We're a slave to that. But yet how this woman, through selling it, wearing it, being involved in it, and going to all these different homes of all these different people, really opens her world. And it's also, of course, by August, is the resignation of Richard Nixon, which I think is an important time historically. We lost faith in so many institutions, and I think the ramifications of that is still playing out. So that's the book that I have, I've been working with. Really deciding on voice is tough, or I should say point of view. And I'm playing with voice, first person. I love the immediacy of first person and the closeness, but then it's so limiting. And yeah, so I'm playing around.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating topic. I can't wait to hear more about that one as well. And I think that you're in the perfect place in California to describe all of the trends and what's happened with women's issues through the years.
And it's so fun. I love research. And I think that's the part that I haven't given myself. I'm almost like cart before horses, because I did a lot of research before I wrote my novel, because it just puts you in the place and you learn these little stories and context of the place and the time. And then it just like, oh, that could happen. That could happen. And I think I need to spend some more time on that. Although most of it is the reading's a little dry, and it's almost like not long enough to have the perspective that you have when you're dealing with the 1890s. But I love, I was reading about, Jen's book. Say that 3 times fast. I think it's Dear Mr. Nixon. It's a collection, her latest collection of short stories. And she was talking about when Nixon went to China, Pat and Nixon went to China, and these photos that were taking these iconic places. And I was like, oh, can I go on eBay? Yes. And now I have that, that Life magazine with these photos that I can look at and think about, what that means for those people reading that Life magazine, and old Avon brochures. And it wouldn't surprise you to know that my mother was an Avon lady. And so this is, tying into also, I mean, everything we write is a little bit about ourselves and our own experience. If we're not writing about our own experience emotionally, then I don't know that we're writing a great book. I mean, we've got to be in there. And, that thing about we're all writing, we write one book and one story, and I can see the themes from my book come up again and again in all of my work and in my plays and stories. And it's really about, we have this construct of what we think our life is about, and it can change at any moment. And unless we learn to sail that boat and kind of go with it and be willing to begin again, it's just it leads to ruin. And that there's just great beauty in destruction because something new can be born. So I write that over and over.
Well, I think writing our books is some kind of therapy for us as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, as always, our last interview question is, our writers over 50 are unique. Do you have advice for writers 50 and above?
So it's that idea. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's never too late, and you will not regret the journey of doing it. And if you've written it and the only people that read it are your friends or your family, you've done the thing. If you have that in your heart to do it. And if you start and you really give yourself the time and space, and then you go, I don't want to do it, that's okay too. It's as we get older, I give myself permission. I stop reading books. If I don't like it, if it's not grabbing me, even though it could be fantastic and I can recognize that, but if it's not grabbing me at the time, I'm not going to finish it. I don't have to. I'm in my 50s. I'm 58, right? And so I'd say that about writing is just give yourself that space. And for me, that the hardest thing is the inner critic. And then that question of, well, where is this going? I'm spending all this time. Where is it going? It doesn't matter. Life is a journey. It really isn't a destination. I mean, we push through that because we'd all like to have our work published, to share it, but just find people that support you in what you're doing. And whether it's writing groups that you're finding online or in person, and just make that space for yourself. It's a gift that you give yourself. So if you have it in your heart to do it, you can do it. And there's nothing I think that's the thing. I mean, I'm proud of the book. I like the book. I stand by the book. The book's great. Buy the book. But the fact that I stuck it out, because it's hard to finish things. It's not easy. And it just feels so great. I don't climb mountaintops. I'm never going to Everest, but this feels like my Everest. And I feel some of the joy that people that climb mountains must feel. So go find your mountain. You can do it.
Those are very wise words today, Kate. I think you really speak truth in everything that you say, and you're a delightful author, and you're willing to share and be so generous with the writing community. So we're excited to say that you're counted among our authors over 50.
Woo! And thank you. You were so generous to do this and to give writers over 50 a platform. And I just find your interviews really interesting. And I pinching myself that I am now one of them. I don't know if I can listen to my own episode, but we'll see.
Yeah. Yes, you will.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday, when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.